Nigeria has produced over 40 billion barrels of crude oil since 1958. At current prices, that is wealth so large it should have built a continent. Instead, Nigeria ranks among the poorest nations on earth, with over 130 million citizens living below the poverty line. But here's what nobody is saying out loud. The oil was never really Nigeria's. Not because it was stolen in the night, but because of what happens in the daylight, in boardrooms in London, Houston, and The Hague, where signatures are exchanged, licenses are granted, and billions disappear before a single naira reaches the Nigerian people. Who signs those documents? Who benefits from those signatures? And why has every Nigerian government since 1960, military and civilian alike, protected the same system? Most channels will give you the headline. We give you the architecture behind it. If you have never been here before, you just found Nigeria's most analytical political channel. Subscribe, because what comes next in this video is the part they hope you never piece together. What happened? The Petroleum Industry Act, the PIA, was signed into law in 2021 after 2 decades of legislative delay. It was presented to Nigerians as the most transformative restructuring of the oil sector in the country's history. It promised transparency, local content, and a fairer distribution of oil revenues. 4 years later, the Niger Delta communities that sit on top of Nigeria's oil wealth remain among the most environmentally devastated and economically abandoned populations on the continent. The international oil companies, Shell, TotalEnergies, ExxonMobil, have been quietly divesting from onshore assets, selling their stakes and retreating to offshore deep-water blocks where Nigerian regulatory reach is weakest and profit margins are highest. Who initiated this shift? The divestment wave was not accidental. It was strategically timed, coinciding with global ESG pressure on fossil fuel investments, but also with a calculated repositioning by IOCs, who identified that onshore Nigerian assets carry community conflict, regulatory risk, and reputational liability. Offshore assets carry none of those risks, and under the PIA's deep-water fiscal terms, they carry significantly lower tax obligations. Why does this matter now? 3 reasons. First, President Tinubu's administration has staked its economic survival on oil revenue recovery. Second, the NNPCL, Nigeria's national oil company, is now a commercial entity under the PIA, but remains majority government-owned, creating a structural conflict of interest that nobody in Abuja wants to resolve. Third, the 2027 elections are approaching, and oil block allocations have historically been the single most powerful instrument of political patronage in Nigerian politics. There is a specific clause buried inside the PIA that effectively allows international oil companies to renegotiate their fiscal terms under conditions that Nigerian regulators cannot independently verify. We will return to what that clause means for Nigeria's actual take from its own oil. The name of the Nigerian politician who has appeared directly or through proxies in the ownership structure of more oil block allocations than any other single individual since 1999. We will get there. Institutions involved. We are dealing with multiple layers here. The Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, NNPCL, now a commercialized entity under the PIA. The Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, NUPRC, the new regulator replacing the DPR, the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, NMDPRA, the Federal Executive Council and the Presidency, which retains ultimate discretion over oil block awards, the National Assembly, which passed the PIA but retains oversight powers it has rarely exercised, International oil companies, Shell, TotalEnergies, Eni, ExxonMobil, Chevron, operating under production sharing contracts and joint venture agreements, and indigenous operators, Seplat, Oando, Aiteo, Hares Holdings, who have been acquiring divested IOC assets. The legal framework. The 1999 Constitution vests ownership of all minerals, including oil, in the federal government under Section 44(3). This means that no state, including oil-producing states, legally owns the crude beneath its soil. The derivation principle under Section 162 gives oil-producing states 13% of revenue derived from their territory, 13% on 40 billion barrels. The PIA operates on top of this constitutional architecture and does not alter it. What it changes is the commercial and fiscal relationship between the government and oil operators. Crucially, it converts NNPC from a government ministry into a limited liability company, theoretically removing it from direct government control. In practice, the government remains the sole shareholder. Where is the ambiguity? The PIA created a frontier exploration fund, where 30% of NNPCL profits are supposed to fund exploration of non-producing areas. This fund is not independently audited. Its expenditures are not publicly disclosed. It sits in a legal gray zone between commercial confidentiality and public accountability, and that gray zone is where billions go to disappear. Nigeria has never successfully completed a full, independent audit of its oil production figures. Every major audit attempted, including the KPMG forensic audit of NNPC in 2015 and the Ribadu report of 2012, was either suppressed, partially released, or quietly shelved. The Nigerian government does not actually know, with verifiable precision, how much oil leaves its shores every year, and the IOCs, who operate the measurement infrastructure, have no legal obligation to share their proprietary production data with Nigerian regulators in real time. Who benefits from the current structure? The answer is layered. At the top, international oil companies operating deep water blocks under fiscal terms that cap government take at levels far below comparable regimes in Angola, Ghana, and Equatorial Guinea. Beneath them, a class of Nigerian intermediary companies whose ownership structures are deliberately opaque, registered through layers of shell companies in jurisdictions from the British Virgin Islands to Dubai, and beneath those, a political class that has mastered the art of converting oil block allocations into electoral financing. Who loses? 135 million Nigerians living below poverty line. Niger Delta communities whose land, water, and health have been destroyed by decades of spills and flares, and who received 13% of derivation while bearing 100% of the environmental cost. 2027 electoral implications. Oil block awards and renewals are expected to accelerate in the 18 months before the 2027 elections. This is not speculation. It is a documented pattern across every Nigerian electoral cycle since 1999. The political cost of an oil license is not paid in cash. It is paid in campaign loyalty, governorship support, and National Assembly alignment. The Tinubu administration is currently navigating the most complex patronage calculation in Nigerian political history, managing northern bloc interests, southern oil interests, and international creditor relationships simultaneously. Silent stakeholders. Western governments whose pension funds and sovereign wealth vehicles hold significant equity in the IOCs operating in Nigeria. Trading houses, Vitol, Trafigura, Glencore, who purchase Nigerian crude at the loading point and whose pricing arrangements with NNPCL have never been subject to transparent public tender. And the City of London's legal and financial infrastructure, which processes the majority of Nigerian oil revenue transactions and takes a cut at every stage. The conventional narrative says Nigeria's oil problem is corruption. That is true, but incomplete. The deeper structural problem is that Nigeria's oil fiscal architecture was designed during the colonial and early post-colonial period to maximize extraction efficiency for foreign capital, not revenue maximization for the Nigerian state. Every Nigerian government since independence has modified this architecture at the margins. None has fundamentally restructured it. The PIA did not restructure it, it modernized it, which is a very different thing. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Federal-state power balance. The oil revenue question is inseparable from Nigeria's federalism crisis. Southern governors, particularly from Rivers, Bayelsa, Delta, and Akwa Ibom, have consistently agitated for resource control, arguing that derivation at 13% is constitutionally inadequate and economically indefensible. The counter-argument from northern states, which receive federal allocations funded substantially by oil revenue, is that resource nationalism would destroy the fiscal basis of Nigerian federalism. This structural tension is unresolved and accelerating. Economic consequences. Nigeria earns approximately 90% of its foreign exchange from oil, yet the NNPCC consistently underperforms its production targets. Crude theft, estimated between 150,000 and 400,000 barrels per day at peak periods, directly reduces Federation account receipts, weakens the Naira, and forces the CBN into forex interventions that destabilize the broader economy. The Tinubu administration's removal of the fuel subsidy was fiscally necessary, but it removed a consumption benefit from 130 million poor Nigerians without first solving the production and revenue leakage problem that made the subsidy unsustainable. Security implications. Pipeline vandalism and crude theft in the Niger Delta are not simply criminal enterprises. They are, in significant part, the economic response of communities that have been systematically excluded from oil wealth for 60 years. The militarization of the Delta under successive administrations has suppressed symptoms without addressing causes. The IOC divestment from onshore assets transfers security liability to indigenous operators who neither have the financial capacity nor the political leverage to manage it effectively. The macro question: does this strengthen or weaken Nigerian democracy? An oil state that cannot account for its primary revenue source cannot build functioning democratic institutions. The opacity of Nigeria's oil sector is not incidental to its democratic deficits. It is the engine of those deficits. Patronage politics, weak legislatures, compromised judiciaries, and captured regulators are all downstream consequences of a resource economy deliberately structured to concentrate information and therefore power in the hands of a small intermediary class. Western government positions. The US, UK, and EU have all issued statements supporting transparency in Nigeria's extractive sector through frameworks like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, to which Nigeria is nominally a signatory. In practice, Western governments simultaneously lobby on behalf of their national oil companies operating in Nigeria, creating a fundamental conflict between their stated governance positions and their commercial interests. IMF and World Bank. Both institutions have pushed for the commercialization of NNPC, which the PIA delivered, and for subsidy removal, which Tinubu delivered. Neither institution has applied equivalent pressure for the transparency reforms that would actually maximize Nigeria's oil revenue take. The structural adjustment logic prioritizes fiscal stabilization over revenue justice. The diaspora dimension. Nigerians in the UK are living in the jurisdiction that processes the majority of Nigerian oil revenue transactions. The City of London, through its law firms, trading desks, and financial intermediaries, is the operational backbone of the system that extracts value from Nigerian oil before it reaches the Nigerian treasury. This is not a distant geopolitical abstraction. It is a structural relationship that Nigerians in Britain are positioned closer to than almost anyone else. The global pattern. Nigeria's oil governance crisis is a specific instance of a global pattern, resource nationalism versus international capital, that plays out across the Gulf of Guinea, the Congo Basin, and Central Asia. The difference in Nigeria is scale. The volume of value transferred from Nigerian oil wealth to foreign capital and domestic intermediaries over 60 years represents one of the largest wealth transfers in modern economic history. The strongest opposing argument. Let me be clear. This channel does not take sides. It takes evidence. And the opposing argument here is substantial. The IOCs and their defenders make a legitimate point. Nigeria's above-ground risk environment, including community conflict, regulatory unpredictability, infrastructure theft, and contract enforcement failures, genuinely justifies elevated risk premiums. International capital requires returns commensurate with risk. If Nigeria wants more investment in its oil sector, it must reduce the cost of operating within it. The PIA was in part an attempt to do exactly that. The divestment wave is less evidence of exploitation and more evidence of rational capital reallocation in a high-risk environment. Misconceptions in circulation. 1. The IOCs are stealing Nigeria's oil. This is legally inaccurate. The IOCs operate under contracts, PSCs and JVAs that were negotiated, signed and ratified by Nigerian government. The problem is not theft in the criminal sense. The problem is that the contracts are structured to Nigeria's disadvantage, and Nigerian negotiators, for reasons that deserve scrutiny, have consistently accepted those terms. 2. The PIA fixed Nigeria's oil governance. The PIA modernized the regulatory architecture. It did not resolve the fundamental problems of production measurement opacity, beneficial ownership disclosure, or the politicization of block allocation. These require political will that no administration has yet demonstrated. 3. Nigerian oil wealth simply disappeared into corruption. This is incomplete. Significant portions of Nigerian oil value were never captured by the Nigerian state in the first place. They were structured out through fiscal terms, transfer pricing, and trading arrangements that are entirely legal and entirely extractive. The single most underreported story in Nigerian oil politics is transfer pricing. IOCs operating in Nigeria routinely sell crude to their own trading subsidiaries at below market prices, then resell at full market value in international markets. The profits sit offshore. The Nigerian tax liability is calculated on the lower internal price. This practice, legal under current Nigerian fiscal law, costs the Federation account an estimated several $billion annually. It is not corruption, it is architecture. Most likely next moves. The Tinubu administration will pursue increased NNPCC production targets to shore up Federation account receipts ahead of 2027, will selectively award or renew oil block licenses in ways that consolidate political alliances, will resist any transparency reforms that would expose beneficial ownership of indigenous operator structures linked to political actors. The IOCs will complete their onshore divestment program, transferring assets to indigenous operators while retaining operatorship of deep-water blocks, will lobby aggressively against any revision of PIA deep-water fiscal terms, will frame divestment publicly as a sustainability and ESG decision while privately driven by risk-adjusted return calculations. Indigenous operators will struggle to raise the financing needed to manage the onshore assets they are acquiring because Nigerian banks cannot extend the scale of credit required, and international lenders apply elevated risk premiums. Several of these acquisitions will face production decline or operational failure within 5 years, creating a new crisis that will be framed as a capacity problem rather than a structural one. The Niger Delta will see escalating community conflict, with indigenous operators with less community relations capacity than the IOCs they replaced, face the same grievances without the same resources to manage them. The securitization response from Abuja will intensify. Signals to watch. Whether the NUPRC publishes verifiable, independently audited production figures, whether any beneficial ownership disclosure requirement in the PIA is actually enforced, whether the National Assembly exercises its oversight mandate over NNPCC's commercial operations, and whether any 2027 presidential candidate makes oil revenue transparency a central platform commitment, and whether that commitment survives contact with the patronage system that funds Nigerian elections. The pattern of political actors appearing, directly or through proxies, in the ownership structures of oil block allocations is not a story about one individual. It is a system. The documentation exists in NUPRC license records, CAC filings, and court proceedings from various litigation involving divested assets. What has never been done is a complete, public, cross-referenced mapping of political beneficial ownership across all active Nigerian oil licenses. That mapping would be the most consequential act of investigative journalism in Nigerian history. It has not happened, and the reasons it has not happened are themselves part of the story. Best case scenario: a combination of IOC divestment, indigenous operator growth, and genuine PIA implementation produces a more Nigerian-owned, more transparently governed oil sector by 2030, with incrementally higher government revenue take and incrementally better community outcomes in the Delta. Worst case scenario: indigenous operators fail to sustain production on onshore assets, deep water revenue is maximized by IOCs under favorable fiscal terms, the Federation account continues to underperform, the 2027 election produces another administration constrained by the patronage obligations incurred during the campaign, and Nigeria enters the global energy transition, in which demand for its crude will decline without having converted 60 years of oil wealth into functioning infrastructure, human capital, or economic diversification. We began with a question: who really owns Nigeria's oil? The legal answer is the federal government of Nigeria. The constitutional answer is the Nigerian people. The practical answer, after 66 years of production, 4 republics, 8 military governments, and 1 Petroleum Industry Act, is that the Nigerian people remain the last beneficiaries of a resource extracted from beneath their feet. This is not an accident. It is an architecture built over decades, maintained across administrations, defended by interests that span Lagos, London, Houston, and The Hague. The question for every Nigerian watching this night is not who to blame. Blame is easy and cheap. The question is whether Nigeria, in the window that remains before the global energy transition closes the oil era permanently, has the political will to restructure an architecture that has survived every reform attempt for 60 years. Because the clock is running, and the signature on the next billion-dollar deal is being prepared right now. You now know something that most Nigerians watching the news tonight do not know. What you do with it is up to you. Share it, debate it, challenge it. That is how democracies survive. Afro News HQ. Nigeria deserves better analysis. See you in the next one.